but between family, colleagues, lovers, you know, friends, neighbors, etc., we can really only manage about 150 relationships. Meanwhile, we live in a world now that you know, if we don't have a blue check next to our name on social media, and it doesn't have an M after the amount of followers, right? Who are we? What's our worth to the world?
Hello and welcome to the Building Men podcast. Building men become the strongest version of yourself mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Back in the studio again, brother. How's it going?
Yeah, buddy. Feeling good.
What do you got there? What's the wait, let me change
What,
the,
this?
Yeah, what's the yellow? What do you got going
It's
on
a
there?
soccer jersey. The Wolverhampton Wolves. What is I'm gonna turn around. What's the dude's name again?
Adama?
Yeah, he's fucking
Is
jacked,
he?
dude. He's yoked. He looks like a fucking rugby player.
Listen to this. We got a wolf here. Hold on.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Good. I didn't know that was coming.
Sound effect. It's too
Caught me.
long.
That's
Too
a
long.
little too long. It's fine. We might need to cut that.
Yeah. We learned how to do sound effects recently. That's for our guest, Matthew. We learned how to do sound effects. We pull him into this episode, too. Why not? So I wanted to introduce the audience to our guest. His name is Matthew Paetz. He is a personal development coach. We just recently had Chase Tuning on the podcast, and I was able to do a deep dive into Chase Tuning's experience on Ever Forward, and I found Matthew Paetz in that way, and I was like, oh my God, we need to talk to this man. He is just, what he's been through in his life has been totally unbelievable, and I cannot wait to get to know you on a deeper level. Matthew, welcome to the Building Men podcast, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. I'm excited.
So
Mostly for the sound effects.
I mean, listen, I have a couple here because we our sponsor is Finish the Race, and the gentleman who is one of the co-founders of Finish the Race has this. His story is a crazy story as well. His name is Joel Glotfelty, and we just got done interviewing him here in the studio, and his experience is wild. But one of the things that he talks about on his journey was that he read the entire Twilight series, you know, the werewolf, and he really resonated with Taylor Lautner, the werewolf in it. And once we heard that, I just went nuts, and we downloaded a whole bunch of fucking clips.
We had like 10 clips.
Like God.
Just of him talking about it and of Taylor Lautner like talking about whatever and taking his clothes off, and it was a wild experience.
Just for shits and giggles, I'm gonna do one more sound drop just to.
All right, one more.
Jacob, put your clothes on.
Now, this may seem strange, really strange, but stranger things happen every day.
Were you able to hear it on your end?
Yeah, I could.
Okay.
And we just had way too much fun in studio with these sound drops. Now that we have this soundboard in front of us, like
can you tell we're new at this? We're
the
sitting here.
sky is the
like,
limit. It's amazing. So,
Well, this is definitely a conversation starter, no doubt.
listen, if you can't start a conversation with a werewolf and Taylor Lautner taking his clothes off, I don't know
what are we really
where
doing here?
else.
What are we talking about?
Then what is it all about?
Is it even
anymore?
worth it? Yeah.
So your background, you do a lot of work with helping people unpack shit in their lives and trauma in their life, and based on a lot of it was your schooling experience, and then a lot of trial and error of shit that you have gone through in your life, and you've kind of come up with some ways to manage shit that you've gone through. So before we get into stuff that you've actually been through in your life, I'm wondering if we can kind of take a walk back into those elementary years. One thing that stood out for me on the podcast that you were on recently was the idea that between the ages of 0 and 6, the idea, like how you form your thoughts around the world and how what you believe to be true. Talk to us. Start there. I mean, because that took. I had to take a step back when I listened to that. So tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, it's a good place to start considering that's literally where it starts, right? No, this fact was a game changer for me when I was going through my, in the beginning of going through my own experiences and learning how to heal and overcome and all that we'll probably get into here shortly. But what you're referring to is between the ages of 0 to 6, we as human beings, we establish over 60% of what we believe to be true about ourselves and the world around us. So what this means is by the age of 6 years old, you've already established well over half of what will eventually become your personal identity moving forward if left unchecked or unexamined, right? Now, the thing that's also interesting between those years, so when you're establishing well over half of what will be your identity, when you're establishing the majority of the patterns that you learn how to quite literally survive the environments in which you're raised, you are also 100% dependent on your caregivers to meet every single physical and emotional need required for your survival, right? So when I say safety or survival, I do mean literal physical survival, right? It's the primitive part of our brains and our nervous systems that's running the show. And so really what this means is all of our patterns of survival that we develop in early childhood are rooted in dependency. So what we're learning how to do is to perform in order to receive, right? So we learn that if I act a certain way, my father will tell me he loves me. If I act a certain way, my mother will tell me she's proud of me. So we basically are learning how to navigate the world by our performance. This is why, it's so much easier for us to identify what others want, right? But when we're asked what do we want, we have no idea, because quite frankly, it's more important for me to know what you expect of me so I can act accordingly to achieve your approval and your acceptance, right? That's biologically speaking, much safer, right? Versus me running around the world just doing things that I want to do and no one approving of it, and essentially me being left to my own devices to survive, on the street, so to speak. So it's extremely important to understand that, a lot of our patterns of survival are rooted in those early years before, we really even know who we are.
I do a lot of work around adverse childhood experiences and how ACEs impact us as adults. Those things that happen between, like you mentioned, zero and 18, say, and it made so much sense to me that idea of seeking approval. We've had a lot of conversations about our experiences growing up. We're 14 years. There's 14 years separating the two of us. So I'm 44. Anthony is 30, and the way that we were raised was very different, but one consistent, and you would probably agree with this, Anthony, is that the need for approval from our father was a real part of our development.
You're the only boy.
That's it. The only two, right? That's it. And I mean, we talked about it. We went out last night and we were talking about conversations that we're having with our father and needing that approval. So if you're during that time, 60% of what you believe to be true about the world and how you view yourself and your identity is established during that time, where does the seeking approval end? I mean, is that something that you can kind of wrap up during that time in your life if you've I'm trying to think about some theorists who believe that you go through these stages of moral reasoning and development. I guess it's Kohlberg is one of the theorists that believes you go through these stages of moral development, and obviously his there's a lot of issues with his work, but are there ways to wrap up this in a way where you're not an approval seeker as you move toward adulthood?
No, I think what happens, so that's an instinctual need, right? We're pack animals, us as human beings, just like wolves, right? Going back to this
drop it again.
Don't drop
it. I won't.
But we are pack animals, and what this means is we require the acceptance or approval of our pack in order to increase our chances of survival, right? Just like pack animals, if you've ever watched the documentary, on the Discovery Channel, call it, if a pack animal is abandoned for one reason or another, what often happens to that specific creature?
They die.
Right.
If they're abandoned, they're done. Yeah.
100%. Right. So human beings are the exact same. So to answer your question, no, our relationship to seeking approval, I don't think ever goes away, but it does get to evolve. Right. So we don't have any choice in regards to where we're born, the families we're born into, the cultures, the dynamics, all of the things. And but as we do grow older, we do have the opportunity to seek new tribes, right? Friendships, colleagues, etc. Creating our own families. But so many of us, I think, remain rooted in constantly seeking the approval of the original tribe, right? And so often, like you said, I mean, you and your brother are 14 years apart, same family, completely different upbringings,
Yep.
right, for various reasons. So, no different than, I'm my father's son, but we grew up completely in two different worlds, right? So the world he grew up in and the world I grew up in are very different. So, what may equate to approval and acceptance in my environment may have been completely shunned in his, right? So to operate with the sole intention to remain in the original tribe, it may not be as necessary as it used to be in regards to like belief systems and those kind of things, right? Which I know that's a big piece that you talk about with what you shared before, like helping adolescents and all of that.
And the idea of tribe and relationships over the last year and a hook, that's been something that people have had to reinvent what that looks like, sounds like, and feels like, because we were missing that. What is it? Oxytocin.
Yeah.
It's that that chemical where you need that physical interaction, and that went away. I have 3 kids, as I mentioned, and I just saw there was a need that they weren't getting met, having that interaction and that tribal feel. We need to be connected to other people, connected to a community. And when that's taken away, what are things that you've seen over in your work over the last year that people have used to supplement or substitute with the lack of that tribal sense?
I mean, the first thing that comes up is the internet and social media more specifically. But the challenge there is, human beings, we're not designed to manage millions of relationships. I think depending on the studies and the research that you follow, we as individuals can only successfully manage around, anywhere between like 100 and 150 individual relationships at any given time. And many of those relationships are, extended, right? They're acquaintances at best. But between family, colleagues, lovers, friends, neighbors, etc., we can really only manage about 150 relationships. Meanwhile, we live in a world now that if we don't have a blue check next to our name on social media and it doesn't have an M after the amount of followers, right? Who are we? What's our worth to the world, right? So we're taking, a system, an operating system that is, our mind and body, and attempting to manage hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of opinions the moment that we enter the World Wide Web, and we're using our status there to equate to our value, our worth in the world. And quite frankly, we're just not designed to do so, right? And I think that's where you see a lot of this depression, is because it's not that we don't have connection with an appropriate amount of people, but rather we have come to assume that we're supposed to achieve the approval of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of individuals all over the world, when we're designed to only manage about 150.
Right. And when you think about, even in the space where we operate, a large portion of it is social media. We need to be able to reach a number of people because we have messages that we are looking to share and to hopefully help other people become better versions of themselves and to deal with past. At the same time, we recognize the need for it, but we can't get wrapped up into the number of followers we have and how many likes we get. But human nature is you think about that. And whenever I find myself thinking about that, I'm like, it's not about that at all. It has nothing to do with that. But you're finding this validation. It's, again, going back to the seeking of approval. You're looking for that number next to your name. Like, we need to increase the number of followers.
Or you're not good enough if you don't have that.
Yeah.
You haven't reached that point yet if we don't have, like we keep talking about, like, oh, we need to get this amount of followers, this amount of likes, this amount of engagement. But at the same time, it's like, then what? And the other issue with social media too is like, what are the comments and the things that stick out the most? I can tell you every negative thing someone said to me on Instagram in the last decade. I just know. I could, off the top of my head, I'm just like, yeah, I remember that, because it stuck with me. I could have all these people saying all this positive stuff, but one person says something bad, and that's the main thing I hold on to. And like, as humans, again, I'm assuming it's like a survival technique, just you're sensing a threat. And is it an actual threat? No, but I'm perceiving it as that. And And so I hold on to that so that I don't ever have to feel that again. And that again, it's just like it's exhausting and causes depression and anxiety and all this stuff.
So why do we
blows up.
do that, Chase? Why is human nature that we will perseverate on that negative comment rather than anything positive?
But it's safety. Again, goes back to physical survival, right? And you already, Anthony, you just mentioned it. Like it's the perceived threat. It's as if imagine, I use this metaphor quite a bit. Imagine we're in a room with a bunch of puppies, right? Literally like the cutest things you've ever seen in your life, like a ton of puppies. But in the corner of this room, there is a, bulletproof box with venomous snakes, right? All kinds of them. What are you going to pay attention to? All the puppies that are running around the room, or, the snakes that are in this bulletproof box in the corner.
Yeah, exactly.
The fucking snakes.
Fucking snakes, right?
Right.
Especially if the puppies start going over by that box, you're really going to freak out.
Oh yeah.
Now, but again, we know consciously that box is, it's sealed, it's locked. There's no way these snakes have the ability to get out. But you are hardwired to filter the environment for the greatest threat, present, again, real or perceived. So when you talk about social media, yeah, you can have 1,000 people say you're amazing, but the moment that one person steps in, it's like, yeah, but your hair looks like shit, right? Like, yeah, but fucking hated the way you said that, right? Or whatever it is. Immediately we hone in on the perceived threat because that's how we survive. If you're in a group of people and they're all smiling, but you see one face that looks angry, you're going to be paying attention to the angry face because that's the biggest threat in the crowd.
So my question would be then, like, do you think this is happening because of the fact that we don't have those significant threats anymore? So like, since we're living in this state of comfort, we're seeking out that discomfort almost and finding these things that otherwise, if there was a serious threat going on, it's a life or death situation, that comment isn't going to make a goddamn difference in the world. But when we're stuck inside on our phones, we have access to food at our phones and TV and shelter, and that's not an issue. Are we instinctually searching for that? And that's why it's, coming up.
Well, I don't know that we're searching for it consciously, but again, that's what we filter the world for. If you did not filter the world for threat, we would have died off a long time ago. So, but you're absolutely right in the sense that, in our world today, our survival is more guaranteed than it's ever been in human history, right? Medical care, food, shelter, accessibility, like all these things that we now have, just right at our fingertips, literally, used to be, the greatest threat to our survival, our ability to hunt and food and, create proper shelter and etc. Whereas today we're still seeking, the threat, but our basic human needs are taken care of. So now our threat is connection, right? Approval, acceptance, etc. And we are going to filter the environment for any sign, real or perceived, that we are not, being accepted into the tribe. Because again, instinctually speaking, if you don't like me, I die, quite literally, right? But now we're doing that on such a mass scale that we're all short-circuiting. We can't comprehend. So I think the skill set now that we are all in the process of acquiring is being able to identify the difference between real and perceived, right? To be more conscious of that comment online not being a direct threat to my survival or my approval or my status in the world, but rather, that's someone's opinion that's most likely a projection based on their insecurity, right? Versus, am I really a piece of shit, right? In someone's story, I probably am, but
right.
And Matthew, you just mentioned that idea of what's the conscious decisions that people are making and what's in your face, but you also mentioned the one podcast that between 90 and 95% of our human experience happens subconsciously, right? So talk to us a little bit about that whole idea of our subconscious and how that dominates.
Well, I mean, if I know many people are familiar with this stat that goes around. I don't know how true it is, but that we only use like 8 or 10% of our brains, right? It's false. We are using 100% of our brains at all time. Maybe 8 to 10% is conscious, right? But our, you know, our subconscious, like for instance, how many, this is a stat that I found interesting to speak to this point. So we as adult human beings, we have roughly between 55,000 and 75,000 individual thoughts per day, right? Individual thoughts. Let's say 55,000 be conservative. How many thoughts can you consciously remember having yesterday? Like, what's the first number that comes up?
750.
Right? And that's extreme.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
We did a lot of podcasts yesterday. There was a lot of shit going on. So
I was gonna say like 20, but
I was gonna say
My-
if I had you write down how many thoughts you remember, you get about 6.
Yeah.
Like, so what did we talk about?
my brain doesn't work as quick
Right.
as yours, clearly, but
Yeah. But interestingly enough, you know, they say about 95% of our thoughts every day are repetitive, right, from the day before. So we may have had 20 thoughts over and over and over and over and over again. But the interesting thing, if you think about even 750 to be extreme, out of the 55,000 conservatively, that means what, like 54,250 went unchecked, unexamined, right? So when you think about your subconscious life, you got 54,250 thoughts going by, you know, unconsciously. You know, what are the odds that the majority of those are actually having a greater impact on your daily life than those 750 that, you know, you may be able to recall?
And then to take it another step, of those ones that are the repetitive thoughts that you're saying that 90 to 95% of the thoughts are the repetitive ones, how many of those thoughts are negative in nature? That we're talking negative self-talk in our mind, that we're listening to those thoughts over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
and then get
100%.
skewed along the way, you know, after again by day 7 of having that same thought that was negative maybe wasn't that negative to start, but over time, you know, it ends up changing a little bit and it ends up being something completely different than what it actually was.
Well, the challenge is when a thought becomes an identity, right? And again, going back to that 0 to 6. So if you think about, you know, so something that I want to kind of tailor into here when speaking of identity. So there's a huge difference between shame and guilt, right? So human beings, we're emotional creatures with the ability to express logic. You know, we're not logical creatures with the ability to express emotion. Right. So emotions are running the show at all times. So we're operating based on how we feel, not what is actually logical. And even the things that we claim are logical, if you take it further enough, you're going to realize you made that decision based on how it made you feel. Right. So, for example, going back to shame and guilt. So shame is, if you look at a hierarchy of emotional like vibration, like if you actually look at the frequency, the energetic frequencies of each emotion, shame is the lowest, right, on the chart, joy being the highest. And if anyone listening is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Let me put it in this context. So have either of you ever been in a really good mood and someone enter the room and they're just not happy at all?
Yeah.
Right. So right there, what happens to your mood?
Yeah, it starts to go down. It starts to get
100%.
Yep.
So that's energy, right? So that's two mismatch energies coming in direct contact with each other. Now, what happens is the higher vibrational energy, in this case, be it joy, it automatically lowers. Why? Survival. So if you think about it, for example, let's say we're going to walk down the street and we're planning to attack somebody, right? We're looking for prey. And across the street, we see someone that's in joy. They're in bliss. What might you see that someone doing if they're just blissful in nature? Like, how would they behave?
There'd be a smile on their face. I almost see people like a jump kick to the side, you know, where you remember those
Do a
old,
little wee, on like a playground or
that's
something.
joy. That
Yeah.
would be with their hands up in the air, big smile on their face.
Right, 100%. Now imagine across from that person, there's someone that's angry. What might you see them doing or behaving?
I'm looking at their nonverbal communication. They have a furrowed eyebrow. You know, there's an aggressive.
They look very
posture.
tense. Yeah, they're very like kind of balled up, shelled up in a way.
They have their
fist clenched.
Fist clenched. Yep.
So which one do you think, if you're looking for an easy target, you're going to choose?
The joy.
Yeah, happy
Yeah,
smiley
100%.
guy.
I'm gonna
of the time.
fucking beat the shit out.
Yep.
destroy him.
Yeah.
He has no idea it's even coming.
That's
right?
how I've beaten
So-
my brother so many times. I just wait for him to do that jump kick in the air, and I take him out. That's our move.
You just wait for him to be
That's it.
happy.
Yeah, he's happy. I'm gonna fuck him up. Yeah, you son of a bitch.
Like,
That's why I have no good memories when I'm
this,
Right.
for all the younger siblings out there, they're like, "Oh, now I get it.
Now I
Yeah, that makes
perfect
sense.
It's good. It's a setup." But no, this is so. If you think about it again, we're all operating in the world, as beings who are looking for the easiest way to survive, right? So if you look at emotions, it is safer for us to remain in lower vibrational emotions like shame, guilt, anger, frustration, resentment, than it is for us to remain in higher vibrational states like joy, happiness, bliss, contentment, etc. Because in the wild, if you're out there just skipping and clicking your heels, the odds of you getting attacked are much higher, or even better, if the odds of you surviving an attack is much lower than if you were to walk around upset all the time, right? Because one, you may fend off someone because they're just going to see you as a more difficult target, and two, if they do try to attack you, you're much more prepared to fight back.
So people go into this self-preservation mode. It's
100%.
especially when people deal with trauma. One of the how it'll manifest. People will be more. They'll be less likely to go through those joyful experiences. They're more guarded. Trauma will impact them in that way. So, how do we combat that then? Understanding that people will go through trauma. Is there a magic pill? Is there something that we could do to help people dealing with those traumatic events when we see people clenched up and in that self-preservation mode?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to safety. Right? So when I say safety, it's again our physical survival more than our emotional comfort. Now, in our society, like safety, it's not feeling judged, not feeling ridiculed, feeling like we'll be accepted despite our flaws, right? So, human beings in our modern world, we are designed to connect, but we are conditioned to impress, right? If I'm impressive, you will accept me. I have value in this world, right? But but connection is a completely different strategy. Connection requires us to be more open, more vulnerable, more expressive in nature. Whereas to be impressive, it's the biggest, the richest, the fastest, the whatevers, right? It's all a projection of achievement versus connection, which only cares about us right here having this open conversation. Right. So when it comes to safety, it's feeling like we won't be abandoned if what's really going on. Right. If I tell you what's really happening, behind closed doors, if I tell you what I really feel, if I share with you something that I think would make me inferior, will you expose that and take advantage of me? Right. Harm me in some way, whether it be emotionally or physically. Or will you prove to be a safe space where I can confide in you, and instead of being met with judgment, I'm met with protection, I'm met with connection, I'm met with mentorship and guidance, right? These are cues. This is why, you said earlier with your professional experience in the school districts, like supporting adolescent males, right? It's one of the most vulnerable stages in our life where we are starting to operate as men, all while not having the experience or the abilities or the conscious awareness of what that actually requires, what that looks like in the modern world. So we're walking around feeling inferior while trying to project security and worthiness and value and significance. And oftentimes how that comes out is through anger, right? Is it safer for me to be angry or insecure?
Angry, yeah.
Right? Which is interesting because anger is often a response of insecurity.
Yep.
Right? It's just like if you look at like someone who's a trained fighter, for example, and I mean like highly trained, right? Do you think call it a special forces, right? Someone that's a Navy SEAL. If a fight breaks out in a bar, do you think that guy's the first one jumping up to prove he can beat everyone up?
No.
No,
He's the calm one, not saying anything in the back, just kind of.
and he's more his blood pressure probably doesn't rise. His heart, he probably is looking at the situation, trying to find a way to protect the people that he's with and get his
Right.
group to safety. It has nothing to do with I have the biggest dick in the room.
Doesn't matter, right? But the kid or the guy that is insecure, he's the one that's popping off, yelling, making all the threats, doing all these things. And it's probably because he's got boys with him, right?
Yeah.
Which again goes back to the pack animal, pack
Yep.
mentality. But the point here is, insecurities are loud, right? Because if you get behind the threat, I'm done, right? Whereas, the guy that's highly trained, he doesn't give a shit about what you're saying, because if it comes to putting hands on each other, he's very confident in his ability
Right.
to walk away, right? So, insecurities are often masked by anger. So you hear it all the time, like even as grown men, like if we've never been made to feel safe enough to talk about our insecurities among one another or among, our families or, our lovers, etc. We're walking around feeling insecure, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Well, how do we protect ourselves? Anger. I won't let you close to that, because if you expose that, I'm done. Right. So anger is often an insecure man's attempt at strength.
That's it's so fascinating to me. Like my mind is getting blown right now, especially with the vibrational, like the energies and feeding off that, and like as a protection and a mechanism of, a way so that we can have security. That to me, because I knew that like the vibrational, like our energies and how you could bring someone up or down depending on how you're doing, but that makes so much sense. That just like really, like boiled it down. Like that was amazing. And then I wonder if like, because you said so in order to like cultivate relationships and have those like long term, like really valuable relationship rather than just impressing someone, you want to connect with someone. How much of that comes to like you looking inward versus, because you can't change other people to always feel comfortable and like you're not going to be judged, right? It's just like there's always going to be those moments where you feel, like you're not going to know the crowd that you're with. I can't just be with my brother all the time because I know that he's not going to judge me and now I can be joyful. So like how much of that comes from within you and looking introspectively and knowing that you could rely on yourself for that?
Oh, I think, I mean, 100% in the sense of, when you are comfortable with who you are, right, to the degree that you have people that love you, have people that care about you, people that will protect you and show up for you, right? We don't require 100,000 people to like us to feel safe in the world, right? Going back to the 150, like we really only require a handful of people, right, to really feel accepted and feel like we have a place in this world and that we'll be able to survive no matter the hardship. So I think when we really know that we are loved and cared about for who we are, because here's the tragedy in this, in attempting to be impressive to achieve survival, what we do is we project this, false sense of security, this false sense of accomplishment, or just this achievement-based approval. Meanwhile, we're feeling deeply insecure. So if you get behind my achievement, all of a sudden you may not accept me. Right. But if we have a handful of people that truly know us for who we are, know our struggles, know our insecurities, know our doubts, know the mistakes that we've made. This is why our best friends are our best friends. Right. Because we know that they accept us for who we are, for what we've experienced, our truth, right, versus our projection. So when we know that we have a tribe that knows who we are through and through, knows our weaknesses, knows our strengths, knows our doubts, our insecurities, and loves us still, not in spite of, but because of, right? Now we can operate in a world with with the ability to develop a different relationship to the judgments of others, right? The disapproval of others, right? Like if I said something on this show today where you guys really, really didn't agree, or you judged me poorly or unfairly because of something that I may share, well, I know that, when we stop recording, I'm going to go back to be with my boys and my family and my girl and all these things who know me through and through. Right. So although that would be an extremely uncomfortable experience, my survival is not at stake because I still have my tribe, and vice versa, right? If I were to judge you guys for something that you said or did or shared or whatever, you know that once this show's done, you can go back and you guys are protected and supported and cared about and whatever. And in my opinion, then as an outsider of your tribe, is no longer such a threat to your value, to your survival, right? But rather it's just it's recognizing that maybe we are of different mind, we are of different background, we are of different whatever, and that does not equate to a threat, but rather we just see things differently.
And I think our survival is assisted with the wolf we have in studio. Should I play it? No, don't do it again. I love that as well. And my work with educators is around the idea of when there is a trauma, and I believe in working with schools. There are 5 needs that students have. I work primarily with teachers of adolescent students, and I tell them those needs are autonomy, competence, relationship, fun, and safety. If we can meet the needs for those 5 developmental needs, if we can meet them within a supportive community, that's where the magic happens in school. When students are dealing with trauma, the way that I talk to teachers about it is you need to go above and beyond in that relationship realm. You have to make them feel so safe and comfortable. That's the only way to do it, is through that supportive, loving community. It's not an overnight thing either. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not like, okay, we're going to connect here and then it's over with. It takes years and years and years. So I'll wrap it back to, we talked about that 0 to 6 years old. You had experiences that were really tragic as you were, going through elementary, middle, high school, that manifests itself in the way that you showed up as an adult moving forward. So at your comfort level, walk us through your experience, going through that really difficult time in those formative years of your life as you were developing your ideas and your identity, your beliefs around the world.
Yeah. So, just to kind of plug it here, Cliff Notes version. So I experienced sexual abuse from an older male starting around the age of 5. Roughly lasted about 5 or 6 years. So between 5 and 11, there's quite literally no 2 things that males can do with each other physically or sexually that I did not experience by my 6th birthday, right? And moving forward, that really kind of planted this seed that my worth was to be a physical experience for others. Now, obviously, at that time and in my younger years, I didn't see it that way, but that's how I began to operate. Right. So, moving forward in the world, I became hypersexual. Focused on, seeking my validation and significance and worthiness and all these things through the physical approval of others. And as I grew older, I struggled with, sexuality. I struggled with self-worth, validation, all of these things. And growing up in a small rural community in Indiana, specifically the sexuality piece really, really fucked with me. And it wasn't because it was, to have experiences with the same sex is wrong or any of those things morally. Like, that's a different conversation. But growing up in the environments in which I did, I feared that made me inferior. I feared that made me weak. That made me, if my friends, my boys in the locker room ever knew that I had those experiences, I would be abandoned. I would be, kicked out of the pack, so to speak. And at that time, that was unacceptable, right? I couldn't afford that, speaking from survival, but it was also my truth, those experiences. Right? So moving forward, and I left Indiana around the age of right after high school. So I graduated and moved to New York City. From there, traveled all over the world through my work at the time in fashion, which exposed me to multiple different cultures. And looking back on it, I realized that was the beginning of my real understanding that so much of our experiences stem from our environments of origin. Right? Had I been raised in a different country, in a different culture, even a different family in my own neighborhood, my belief systems could have been completely different. Right? My ideas of what's right and wrong could have been completely different. So what those experiences began to teach me is that not not all experiences are judged the same, depending on the environments, right? So I learned that there was possibility that I could be accepted for who I was, depending on the groups in which I shared, right? And as I began to navigate those conversations and begin to open up more about the things that I'd been through, um, I began to realize that there was more people than I had ever imagined that had had similar experiences. Um, and through that, I began to realize that most of our struggles were due to the things that we were too afraid to share. Right. So my story includes, like I said, sexual abuse. It led into um, uh, alcohol, drugs. I even became an escort for a period of time. All of that came to a head one morning when I almost committed suicide on a cocaine crash, right? Where literally in the midst of a breakdown, just started, what started coming out of me was just all of the shame that I was carrying, right? I mentioned earlier, there's a difference between shame and guilt. So the biggest difference between shame and guilt is, guilt says, I'm sorry for what I have done, behavior, right? Shame says, I'm sorry for who I am, identity, right? I am the problem. So anytime someone says, I am not enough, I'm not smart enough, attractive enough, rich enough, tall enough, whatever enough, what they're actually saying is their shame, right? They believe they are a problem. They are at fault for something, versus the experience or the behavior. So I truly believed that I was broken. Right. And the part that really started to get me is because, like most of us, it happened at such a young age that uh, I really felt like my life was taken from me before I had a chance. So many of the decisions that I was making as an adult, I was simply trying to survive or, make sense of what was going on internally, only to continue to make decisions that created more shame, created more guilt, created more insecurity. And then it had just gotten to a point where, I was at a crossroads. It was either turn and face all these decisions head on, right? Begin taking ownership and responsibility and, working through them and sharing my experiences with those who I loved, who I was afraid it would affect, and being more candid with why I was responding, the ways that I was, or completely escape, right? And I say that all the time, that the morning that I almost committed suicide, I learned two extremely valuable lessons. The first was that I didn't want my life to end, but I wanted my life as I knew it to end. And at the time, I didn't know another way. And mind you, I'm 37 now. I was about 33 on this particular morning. But when I say I didn't know another way, that's what I believed for a long time. But the more that I actually reflected on it, I realized that also wasn't true, because I did know another way. But that leads me to the second thing that I learned, which was uh, if I was willing to go that far that morning. Um, and there's more layers to this, but I literally had my girl. She was on FaceTime. So I had a loaded handgun. That's the means in which I was going to choose to use if I, you know, went through with it. But she was on FaceTime and she watched me load the weapon. I was in a complete breakdown. We were in an argument and I started to spiral, and she witnessed the whole thing. And then she eventually got my mother and my sister on the phone, who were two of my closest as well. So the three closest people in my life were on the same call. Mind you, my mother and my sister had no idea. It was about 7 in the morning, our time. On the West Coast, it was about 10 a.m. their time. They thought they were just getting a call from their son, or their brother. They had no idea what was going to be on the other line. So once they did, what was coming out of me was all of my insecurity, all of my shame, all of the not enoughs, all of the problems, all the struggles that I'd had, and I was just spewing all this stuff. Meanwhile, they have no idea. They're completely hopeless. They're not there. They're not present. They know what the mindset that I'm in. They know that I have, access to a weapon. Um, so all of that to say, if I was willing to go that far, which I clearly was because I was doing it, then the second thing that I learned is I no longer had the luxury of fear. What I mean by that is I could no longer be more afraid of my truth than I was my own death. And I could no longer be more afraid of my insecurities than I was putting three of the most important human beings in my life through that morning. Right. So what I learned was that moving forward, if I was willing to go that far, then I could no longer avoid an uncomfortable conversation. I could no longer avoid, uh, you know, being courageous enough to share my story, to, uh, you know, begin the process of healing those experiences, right? Because again, the alternative was the ultimate escape, which, you know, that could continue, but
Well, Matthew, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's a deep journey into your past. I know, like, obviously one of the most traumatic experiences a child could go through, and then as an adult going through that situation with your girlfriend at the time, your mother, your sister on FaceTime with you. Can you recall, was there a phrase that was said? Was there something that you saw? Was there where you decided to unload the gun and put it down? Was there one specific thing that was like, okay, I heard this, I saw this, and now I'm not going to do it?
hmm you know, I've never been asked this question, but there is one very specific image. And I was in a friend's apartment at the time. And again, I'm holding the weapon, and I had this visual of the scene that would be left if I were to do it. Right? He wasn't home. He was out of town. I was by myself. All this, and all I kept thinking about, or the image that kept going through my head was that, you know, if I were to do this, the what I would be leaving for others to find. Right? I knew it was like internally, like I knew that wasn't okay. It wasn't fair. Um, and then the second thing that comes up when you ask that question is, uh, I think this had a greater impact than I think I gave it credit. Um, but speaking to suicide specifically, in that moment, what I knew was that I could always make that decision. Right? I could always make the decision to end it. But if I made that decision, there's no coming back. So that was also a shift in me. It was like, okay, there's another way, right? And if it gets too bad, I can always make the decision later. But I don't have to make the decision today. And that for me was a huge game changer, because it gave me permission to move forward, right? Because if I was already in this much pain, you know, and to the point that I was willing to end it, well, what would happen if tomorrow felt better, and then the next day felt better, and the next day felt better? And now in hindsight, you know, I've learned a lot about, you know, psychology and you know, the trauma and how we process it and all these things, and even, you know, understanding you know, suicide prevention. um Again, if you're willing to go that far, there's nothing that will keep you from being able to go further in your truth, right? Like I'm a little speechless right now, because again, I've not thought about it in this way. So thank you for the question. But um, if there's anything I can tell you right now, is the days that I've had since that morning have been the best days of my life. Quite literally. And I had a lot of amazing days prior to that. I'm not saying there weren't any, but what I'm saying is I'm speaking directly to anyone that may have had these feelings or may be experiencing these feelings right now. The days that come after you decide to face your shit head on will be the best days of your life. And I can tell you firsthand that the amount of fear and overwhelm and anxiety and heartbreak that came with taking ownership for my story, taking ownership for my decisions that I was making as an adult, there's a spectrum. And as difficult as those days are, the other side of them will be equally as amazing. Right? So trust that the other side of it is so much more fulfilled than you ever thought possible. Because if you can be in that much pain, you can also be in that much joy.
So I'll take a step backward to eventually take two steps forward. So this
How's that a
happened.
metaphor for life?
Exactly. This happened when you were 33 years old.
Hmm.
So there's 28 years that elapse from the time that the abuse began up until the time
Hmm.
that you're at this crossroads in your life. If you had an opportunity to go back, not only to yourself but to someone, we mentioned before, building men, it's about, you know,
Hmm.
where it started was kids going through their adolescence as they're developing their real sense of where they fit in the world and their identity, and kind of coming up with their own voice. If
Hmm.
someone is experiencing something like you went through, what what do they need to hear right now, or what would you have needed to hear at this time that could have helped you avoid that time when you were 33 years old?
Oh shit. It's so what I know. So from my experience, and I want to take the long route here, I think, to answer this question. Again, you're asking questions I haven't been asked before, so thank you. Um, I I think something that's important for those who have never been through something, not just like sexual abuse, but just anything that is extremely traumatic to someone. Like if you don't have that direct experience, there's a couple things I think that's important to understand, which is one, a lot of the behavior around protecting and hiding those details and those stories. It's not, yes, it's self preservation, but a huge part of that, again, is the attempt at protecting those who you fear it will affect, it will harm. Like for instance, mine, I was afraid that it would destroy my family if they ever found out. I was more afraid of how my mother would take it, as someone who I knew would take responsibility, right? Even though she was had nothing to do with her whatsoever, right? But I was terrified that if she ever found out, she would assume the blame, right? So she was actually the last one I ever told, and that was, again, shortly before, rather, that morning when I was 33. She was already aware, but it was a long journey to bring those who I was most afraid it would affect into the story. Right? I had no issues telling a stranger, but if it came to someone that I thought, would carry shame because of my choices, or carry shame because they fear or they thought they were supposed to be there to protect me, I I refuse to put that burden on them, or at least that's how it felt. Um, so when people say like, "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Trust that it's not out of weakness. It's not out of any of that stuff. But a lot of times they don't know it because they don't understand. Right? They're just trying to navigate it themselves. But their biggest fear is how it would affect those around them. It's safer for us to keep it to ourselves because then it's only us that's hurting, right? Versus putting our family or our friends or our spouse or our children through it. So trust that if they're not sharing, it's not because they don't want to, and it's not because um, they're weak, but rather they probably assume that it's better off that only they have to suffer through the truth or through the experience. Um, and then as far as what do I wish I had at that time, it's interesting because, for instance, the abuse that I suffered, like, it wasn't violent. Right? As a matter of fact, it was quite the opposite. I was convinced that I was chosen. I was convinced that I was privileged to be in that position, to get that kind of attention. I was told that this is how I was being taught what to do when I was with a girl one day. So I actually protected the experience as a child because I was made to feel like I was chosen, although instinctually I knew it's not where I wanted to be. I knew it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. But again, I was made to believe that I was this, like, again, I keep using this word, chosen. I was special because I was getting this type of attention. Um, so I protected it, right? Because that's what I was convinced I was this chosen special, person, while obviously having no idea what was actually, you know, going on, or how I would eventually feel about it, later in life.
Have you ever had the opportunity to confront the person who did this to you?
They were present in my life for a long time. It was never directly spoken about. Right. But here's the thing too. And I'll say this is, I don't know all the truth, but I know enough to assume that they were abused. Right. So a lot of, people that, become the abusers are often, a product of the abuse themselves. And, if you allow yourself to look at how trauma manipulates over time, over generations, it's, it goes back to, the inability to ever feel safe to share what's going on. Right. If one is left to their own devices, we don't know what direction they're going to take it. Right. But, it's, it, it's trauma's, it's its own pandemic. Right. This idea that we're supposed to appear as if we're always in control, always the strongest, the smartest, the sexiest, the richest, the whatever. I mean, that's the that's the pandemic, right? It's this illusion that we're supposed to always um, be the best in order to be worthy of love and acceptance and approval, versus being able to recognize that life is a team sport, and just like any athlete, if your teammate's not playing well that day, you don't just fucking kick them off the team, right? You step up, right? If your star player is injured, someone steps up, right? Life is the same way, but we treat our personal lives as if we're never allowed to be injured, we're never allowed to have an off day, right? So we assume that when we do, it makes us unworthy of the love and attention that we all actually require for our survival.
All right, so deep dive here. If you
Going
had,
deeper.
this is about as deep as we'll go, and then I'll get back to shallow water. If you had a minute to have a conversation with that person, what would you say? What would be what would the conversation look like?
First words that came up was, "I'm sorry," and I'm sorry for what was done to you. Right? Because I truly believe that they didn't, whatever experience they may have gone through wasn't their choice either. Right? And uh, you know the way that I view it now, and you know, I'm sure some will understand, some won't. What I'm about to say next is that my abuse was, in hindsight, one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given. Now, I don't say that to say I justify the abuse. I don't say that to say that if I went back, I wish it continued. No. But what I'm saying is, having been through it and having, seen how it can affect lives, and now being on the other side of being able to support people that have been through, many things similar, um, it's, my abuse became my responsibility. And this is why I'm so transparent about my story today. It's, I've said it before. If you've ever heard me speak on this stuff, it's my story, but it's not about me. Right? I don't share my story for those who it will shock. I don't share my story for those who it will offend. Right? But rather, I share my story for those who are still too afraid to share their own. I share my story for the guy that's listening to this podcast right now that has never felt safe enough to say, like, me too, I've been through it. And I share my story for those to see that, uh, the ways that we respond to our traumas as we try to figure it out ourselves, the things that we do that we carry the shame around, um, they're not your identity. Right? The greatest thing that was ever given to me was grace. And it was given to me by many, but where that began for me, that awareness, was the morning that I almost committed suicide. Again, I was eventually, when things kind of calmed down, and my girlfriend eventually figured out where I was and came and picked me up, and that's a whole thing as well. But where they took me was an acute trauma therapist, basically the ER for emotional well-being, right? And I wouldn't know who this woman is today, the therapist. She could walk into my house, I would have no idea who she is. Don't remember her name. I don't know anything about it. I only spoke to her once. But out of the hour and a half I know that I was in her office, I remember one sentence above all the rest. And that was so when I walked into her office, having just gone through that experience, my intention was to finally give someone everything. And, so I shared every single detail that I could possibly conjure up about my life and to why I was in that situation that morning. And it was the very first sentence out of her mouth that I remember that changed my life forever. And it was, after sharing with her the cocaine, after sharing with her the escorting, after sharing with her the sexuality and all these things, her very first words to me were, "No shit, you found cocaine. What were you supposed to do?" And again, I knew in that moment she wasn't giving me permission to go do it. Right? She was giving me grace and understanding. She met me where I was because I was fully anticipating that, okay, so this is what we're going to do. These are the 12 steps. This is who you're going to go talk to. Right. And we're going to, you're going to make me realize that, those decisions were wrong and all these things. But instead, she literally says to me, "No shit, you found cocaine. What were you supposed to do?" And then went on to explain to me how cocaine affects the same parts of the brain as sex does. And for people that, struggle with sexual addiction, like, that drug is like, it's game over when they find it. Right. And then she began to give me this understanding. And the more I understood myself as a biological creature, why I was responding this way, why, the things that I had done made complete sense given my story, all of a sudden I began to create enough space to give myself grace. And then with grace, you're able to give yourself forgiveness. Right? Because I think forgiveness is a big thing that people often misunderstand. Real forgiveness changes the future, not the past. Right? And I'm sorry changes tomorrow, not yesterday. Right? Because your behavior changes. And I think the biggest thing about forgiveness is that if we truly forgive, we fear that that is in some way telling the other person or persons that what they did was okay when it wasn't. Right? But forgiveness says I'm no longer carrying it. Right? Doesn't mean I'm justifying it. And when I was able to give myself forgiveness for the things that I had chosen and the things that I'd been through, that's when I was able to begin to look at my history and extract the wisdom from those experiences versus just the suffering. And I really think that's the key to trauma these days, like creating a safe space for people to be able to begin extracting some of the wisdom from those experiences versus just the suffering.
As people go through these hero's journey that you have obviously been on, there's that mentor sage role that someone obviously plays. And this woman who, like you mentioned, you couldn't pick her out of a crowd right now, but that one comment that she made, it made all the difference. And you took that, and it's all the superheroes, there's something that impacts them. Initially, it's seen as something negative that they take, and it makes them stronger in the future. And that's what you did. So fast forward, to that, after that day when you were 33 years old, and you said the next day it becomes better, the next day becomes better. You took this negative 28-year experience, not all negative, obviously, but that when you finally were able to start to deal with it, you took that and now you're using it to help other people and to help other people deal with their trauma. So how do you go about working through that? So someone comes to you where they're experiencing something challenging. How do you take your experience and help someone pull themselves out of that challenging situation?
Well, I mean, there's obviously different tools and strategies depending on the circumstance. But I would say, one of the biggest things, again, is transparency. Right. So the one consistent thing, and with respect to the conversation, with respect to the details and context of someone's story, that they may be sharing with me, one of the things that I really began to understand in hindsight, now, just looking at my education, right, the psychology background, and, better understanding myself from that perspective, is that going back to the emotional creatures with the ability to express logic, like emotions running the show. So for instance, if I asked you today, like, is there anything that you carry shame about around in your life? Like, do you know what shame feels like, would be the question.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Right. But I didn't ask you what made you feel shameful, right? Because what may have caused you shame may be different than what's caused me shame. right? Or anyone else listening, but we all know exactly how it feels to carry shame, right? So in context to a mentor relationship or a coaching relationship or healing relationship, it's not attaching ourselves to the details of one story, meaning, okay, I was sexually abused and maybe they weren't, right? That doesn't mean there's no connection, because if we go beneath the actual experience, the context, and look at, well, what's the emotion that created? What's that, identity that created? Well, now we can find common ground, right? Because again, if we're talking about men, like, do you know what it feels like to be weak or feel weak? And as do I. But again, the moment that made you feel weak may be different than mine, but we both know exactly how it feels
Right.
to feel weak and inferior.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to speak to how you process the emotion and how you create understanding around, again, the hierarchy of emotions, shame, guilt, resentment, anger, etc., and begin to make sense of these emotions and what role they play in our lives, we are able to see them as what they are versus seeing them as our identities. It's really an identity conversation, right? It's who we believe we are. It's quite frankly, our identity is the most addictive thing on the planet, right? And this is the challenge, going back to that 0 to 6, is the identities that we assumed around the age of 7. And the reason why that's so specific is it's around the time our brains develop, the neocortex, prefrontal cortex more specifically, that's responsible for executive functioning skills, foreshadow, creative problem solving, etc., conscious awareness. This piece is beginning to develop. So we assume that the identity that we've created by the age of 6 is who we are, right? So this is why a lot of us don't feel enough. For example, when you were 6 years old, if you went out to do something and you weren't strong enough to do it, right? Physically, you just literally were a 6-year-old boy, didn't have the ability to pick that thing up, and you went to pick it up and couldn't do it. You may have just assumed that experience means you are weak, right? Because you saw your dad pick it up, so why can't you? Right? Your older brother picked it up, why couldn't you do it? Right? So you assumed in that moment that, oh, it's because I am weak, because you have no idea, you have no way at that time to say, oh, I'm 6 years old, no shit, I can't pick up that rock, no shit, I can't pick up that log,
Right.
right? Like, I'm 6. You can't, that's not how we function. So instead of recognizing that, it's circumstantial, we see it as it's an extension of ourself, our identity, our abilities, right? So this is the problem. This is the challenge, right? When we move into adulthood, if that's left unexamined, we're going to take those seemingly trivial experiences that we had as a kid and assume that is who we are. We are not enough because at that time we weren't, right? But today, as a 44, as a 30-year-old, as a 37-year-old, we're more than capable, but we may never try because we assume we still believe that we're not strong enough.
The other thing I think happens is when you're trying to come to terms with a lot of the trauma that you've experienced, is there's this thing that happens where we think one of two things, or people think one of two things. Either if my brother and I are having a conversation and maybe he's gone through something more challenging than I might have the thought process, who am I to complain about my trauma? His was way worse.
The trauma Olympics there.
Yeah. Or it's like a competition. Oh yeah, you had this. Well, I had this, and rather than just understanding, we all deal with our shit. Everybody has stuff that's happened to them. It's how we process it, how it enters our brain, and how we manifest, and then how we deal with it in our adulthood. It has nothing to do with a competition between two people and how they've dealt with it.
But it's also, so that competition is a form of protection, right? And you said it spot on. Like, if I hear someone else's story, I could, one of two things. I could either say like, oh, you don't know shit, you haven't been through anything I've been through, right? And I discredit them.
Yeah.
Or I could hear that person's story and think to myself like, oh, like, who am I to feel the ways that I do? I've not been through anything that person has, right? And I discredit my own experiences. And what that does, no matter what, is it creates this disconnection between me and the person I may be speaking to or listening to, right? And I completely shut down from the wisdom, from the lesson, from the opportunity there, because I've now made our context a competition, right? Versus, oh, they went through that thing. and that made them feel inferior. I also went through things that made me feel inferior. Well, how do we manage the feeling of being, how do we manage feeling inferior? Oh, you do this, this, and this, right? And now we see each other as more of the same, even the context was very different. So I think it's extremely important to recognize again that, pay closer attention to the emotions that that experience is creating in someone, not the context, right? And the so many things going through my mind right now about this, but I think that's extremely important for any of us to understand, right? And I think this just hit me, and it's completely random, but it's also not. Research shows that I know that the majority of your audience are men. I think it's extremely important to understand that men and women, although we understand our bodies process shame in the same ways, the things that create shame, the deepest shame, can oftentimes be very different. For example, what creates the most amount of shame in women, based on research, is beauty. Anything that makes them feel less attractive, they can carry a lot of shame, right? Whereas men, the thing where we carry the most shame is anything that makes us feel weak, right? So strength, right? So it's important to understand that, when we're communicating with our better halves, right? Be it our sisters, our daughters, our lovers, our mothers, etc. Being very mindful that the way that we feel as men when we're made to feel weak is the same experience they're having when they're made to feel less attractive in any way. And this is not a superficial conversation. This is biological, right? Because again, if you go back to the tribal days, right, it's really all about procreation and survival. So a female who is deemed less attractive to, the better suited, more genetically desired males of the tribe, they're considered, less valuable on the biological chain, just as a man who is not strong and powerful and capable of protecting and providing will also be viewed as less valuable on the genetic chain, right? This is why instinctually we care about being the alpha and women care about being the most attractive, right? It's not a superficial conversation, it's a biological one. And I think that when we allow ourselves to recognize that, we are yin and yang, and, as men, when we, give our women so much shit about how much they care about the way they look and being high maintenance or whatever it is, we'll project on them. Meanwhile, if she says to us like, oh, you can't afford that, and we completely lose our shit, right? It's the exact same emotional experience. Right. We are challenging each other's biological value in the genetic chain. And if we are being made to feel lesser than, biologically speaking, then what's the point? We have no value in this system, so why are we here, right? And it becomes self-preservation.
A wise man once said, "It's not your mindset that holds you back; it is your biology." That was you. That was you. That was you that said that. It fits right in here. It's not, when people think about their mind, but it's a lot of it is our DNA coding. It's how we're genetically made up, and how we can get into we could do a part 2 of this podcast
when
about...
you can dissect it like he is, though, it makes it so much more understandable. And like I'm sitting here digesting this, and my mind is fucking blown right now, and I'm like almost speechless in a sense, because it all is coming together. Like all of what you're saying, it makes sense. Like all of these things that you're talking about, I've experienced in my life, and I've had those feelings, and I know exactly what that feels like, and that makes perfect sense and lines up perfectly with everything. Like it really is mind blowing.
You had an epiphany today.
I did, yeah.
Well, superpower.
There we go.
It is. The epiphany provider.
Like I said, you've asked questions, and I've said things in this podcast that I haven't said in some conversations, let alone for the consumption of many who I may never meet. Which, by the way, is the most terrifying thing about doing these shows.
Right, I hear you.
These things, because here's what, and I even sit here and process as I'm deciding how I'm going to respond to some of these questions. Right, I'm having a conversation with Dennis and Anthony. I feel very comfortable here, and I can just go in and be like, yeah, let's talk. What do you want to talk about? Like no topic off limits. But there's also this awareness that this is being recorded and it's going to be shared with the masses, right? And I can't control their response to how what I'm sharing. So there is a deep fear that comes up, going back to triggers, right? There's a deep fear that comes up that's like, oh shit, there's going to be someone that takes something I said out of context. There's going to be someone that takes something I said and completely judges me because as soon as they heard it, they didn't hear the last part of the sentence, right? Because they completely shut down, and now I'm being judged for saying that, I struggle with X, Y, and Z, or I've made this decision, in my past. And I think it's just extremely important that, this goes back to your question about safety. I've had to learn through immense ridicule and public exposure and, these challenges that, again, if my story was strong enough at one point for me to think that I wasn't worth living, then, and that's how I believed it. Right. But now I'm on the other side where I see the value in, all of our stories, specifically the parts that we fear, that the judgment, as uncomfortable as it may be, for every one person that comments a negative thing, there's going to be one person that doesn't say anything that may have saved their life. Right. And I think that's the part too, where when you begin to trust that those who were intended to receive the message got it, whether I ever hear about it or not.
I truly believe that. It's like Spider-Man. Uncle Ben, I think it was Uncle Ben, said to Peter Parker, with great power comes great responsibility, and the power in your words. There's the responsibility that comes along with it. But what I truly believe is, anyone that's listening to this, you can't help but be, one, totally emotional about this, the journey that you've taken us on, Matthew, and then two, inspired to step forward. When you're going through something challenging or something difficult, to step forward, or to reach back and help someone behind you step forward. I've been inspired by our conversation. I know my brother has as well. Yeah. I haven't seen him this speechless in years.
Like, so. I can't wait to listen back to this, because the wheels are turning, and
that's good, because I probably won't.
I would love to have you back on for a follow-up. There's so many things I want to talk to you about, in regards to masculine and feminine energy, rites of passage with young men. We've been going an hour and a half already, so I want to make sure to honor your time. But I would love to have you on for a part 2 in the future as well. I absolutely love talking to you.
Absolutely, and I would be honored to come back. And I wasn't even paying attention to the time. I don't have a clock around me right now, but I do want to always leave something of value that people can take and actually implement starting right now if they choose to, in every one of these conversations. And perhaps this will bring us full circle. But going back to the beginning, when we talked about the difference between connection and impressing, and how we often use our achievements as a metric of validation or worth. Right. But instead, for anyone listening to this, I want to just shift your perspective ever so slightly, if you allow me. And, that's, if we look at the things that motivate us or inspire us to take action and create something new in our lives, we often look at what is our goals, what is it that we want to achieve, right? This external checkpoint that, man, once we get there, then, right, that piece, recognizing that, oftentimes, if we place, not often, always, if we place our value or our significance on an achievement, this external checkpoint, once reached, you will discover a false summit. You will discover that you may have achieved the thing, but you actually arrived feeling more void than you ever have. And the reason that is because we assume that the thing is what is supposed to provide us this self-worth, this validation, this purpose, significance, whatever it may be. So instead of, if someone's really interested in taking this journey, instead of looking at what you want to achieve, begin thinking about, who do you want to become? Right? Because if you start thinking about it in the sense of like, who am I becoming? Right? I want to become a man of integrity. I want to become a man of courage. I want to become a man of value and significance. Then that brings you to the present moment at all times, no matter what you've achieved. Right? Because, for instance, my thing is courage. So if I want to become a man of courage, then anytime that I feel overwhelmed, I feel anxiety or fear or inferior or whatever it may be, I ask myself in that moment, what would courage do? Right? Because to become a man of courage is simply making several small decisions that require it. right? It has nothing to do with the achievement what I do. And the thing that I think is interesting is if you allow yourself to look at, you know, when you think about who you become, imagine what that man can achieve. Right? All of a sudden, there's no more finish line. There's no more checkpoint. Right? It just becomes a way of living, a way that you show up on a daily. It becomes your life versus your resume.
That's beautiful, man.
Just the idea of being about it, be it, you know, until you are. Yeah, just.
Matthew, where can the Building Men podcast listeners find you?
In my room crying right now.
Like we need to send you a care package, a blankie, and
no, I can be found on Instagram primarily. Is if I'm on socials, that's where you'll find me, and it's at Matthew Paetz. And yeah, that's probably the quickest and most efficient way.
we'll put your contact information in the show notes for people to find you. This will be up on all the podcast sites, and it'll be up on YouTube as well.
Good.
Yeah.
It's great. Excited.
Just enough time for you to move out of the country.
Share it with everyone.
Change the name, move out of the country. We'll be ready to go. To find Building Men is building.men on Instagram, Building Men Coach on at gmail.com. Anthony, you got any last words? Wolfman?
No, the wolf, yeah, don't play it again. But Matthew, seriously, thank you. This was awesome. This was such an experience for me, and such I just felt like I was on this emotional roller coaster ride with you that whole entire time. So forgive me for being like kind of struck, and I don't really know what to say, but that was amazing. It really was. Like, I thank you for being so authentic and open and honest, and just inviting us into this part of your life, because I know how many people this is going to impact, and I really appreciate that. It's really been amazing.
Thank you both for creating the space for it. Not just in this conversation, but all the things that none of us will ever know that it took for you to get here, right? So honoring those moments, I think, is extremely important.
We certainly appreciate that. If you're listening, you're gonna laugh
Still.
Yeah, no. Consider writing a review and sharing this podcast with someone that you think it might benefit. I mean, obviously, there are people in all of our lives that could benefit from a message of resiliency, of courage, of hope. Someone that has gone through hell and back and lived to inspire other people through his message. Go a step further than you thought you can go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.